Blood is thicker than water, but money is a venom that poisons both. Clara Harrington had it all: an untouchable trust fund, a penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline, and a guaranteed position as the CEO of her father's billion-dollar real estate empire. Overnight, a single signature on a revised will strip her of her legacy, leaving her with exactly $300 and a box of worthless childhood keepsakes. Desperate and betrayed, she gambled her last remaining ounces of dignity on a crumbling, bankrupt bookstore on the foggy edge of town. She thought she was inheriting a worthless burden to finalize her humiliation. She didn't know she was holding the key to a 50-year-old conspiracy that would bring the Harrington empire to its knees. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Abernathy, Cole and Partners, mirroring the storm raging inside Clara Harrington. At 28, Clara had dedicated her entire adult life to the Harrington Hospitality Group. She had brokered international deals, sacrificed her personal life, and earned her place as her father's rightful successor. Richard Harrington had been a titan of industry, a man whose handshake was an ironclad contract, and a father who had meticulously groomed his daughter to take the reins. But Richard was gone now, victim to a sudden, aggressive stroke that had stolen his mind before it finally stopped his heart. Sitting across the long mahogany conference table was Victoria, Clara's stepmother of barely 3 years, clad in ostentatious mourning couture. Beside Victoria sat Pierce, her son from a previous marriage, who was currently attempting to hide a smirk behind his manicured hand. Thomas Abernathy, the family's silver-haired attorney, cleared his throat. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "We are here to read the final will and testament of Richard Edward Harrington," he began, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. That was her first warning sign. Abernathy had known her since she was a child in pigtails. His sudden inability to look at her sent a cold spike of dread down her spine. "I will skip the standard legal preamble and proceed to the distribution of assets," Abernathy said, his voice unusually tight. He adjusted his reading glasses. "To my wife, Victoria Harrington, I leave the primary residence in Beacon Hill, the summer estate in Martha's Vineyard, and a 60% controlling stake in Harrington Hospitality Group." Clara stopped breathing. 60%. That was impossible. Her father had explicitly outlined in countless meetings that Clara would receive the controlling shares. Victoria was only ever meant to receive a generous cash stipend and the vacation properties. "To my stepson Pierce," Abernathy continued, his voice monotone, "I leave the remaining 40% of Harrington Hospitality shares, alongside my vintage automotive collection." "Wait!" Clara interrupted, the word tearing from her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Thomas, that's wrong. You know that's wrong. The draft we finalized 6 months ago." "Clara, please," Victoria purred, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "This is difficult enough without your outbursts. Your father made his final wishes very clear." "He was incapacitated," Clara shot back, standing up. "He didn't even recognize me during his last 2 weeks. He couldn't have authorized a new will." "The addendum was signed and notarized precisely 3 weeks ago, Clara," Abernathy said softly, finally looking up. His eyes held a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He was deemed legally competent by his attending physician, Dr. Aris Thorne. "Apologies, Dr. Aris Sterling." Clara's mind raced. Dr. Sterling, Victoria's personal physician, a man who had suddenly taken over her father's care just before his cognitive decline rapidly accelerated. The pieces of the betrayal were snapping into place with sickening clarity. "What about me, Thomas?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What does my father's competent mind leave his only biological child?" Abernathy flipped to the last page, swallowing hard. "To my daughter Clara, I leave the sum of $1, ensuring there is no misunderstanding regarding her exclusion from my financial estate. I also leave her the sole ownership of the LLC containing the deed to 42 Brimstone Lane, located in the town of Oakhaven, Massachusetts. May she find there what she truly deserves. The room plunged into an oppressive silence. $1. It was the ultimate legal insult, a deliberate slap in the face designed to prevent her from contesting the will on the grounds that she had simply been forgotten. Brimstone Lane, Clara whispered. What is that? It is a commercial property your father acquired decades ago, Abernathy replied, closing the thick leather folder. A bookstore, I believe. Long abandoned. The property taxes are fully paid through the end of the year, but the building itself holds negligible market value. Pierce chuckled softly. Looks like you're going into retail, Clara. I hear minimum wage builds character. Within 24 hours, the full reality of her disinheritance crashed down upon her. Clara's corporate credit cards were instantly declined at a coffee shop. Her access badge to the Harrington Tower was deactivated, confiscated by a security guard she had personally hired. When she returned to her penthouse, an apartment owned by the company, not her, she found Victoria's personal security team waiting in the lobby. She was given exactly 30 minutes to pack a single suitcase of personal, non-luxury items, standing on the rain-slicked pavement of Boston, holding a rolling suitcase and a small cardboard box containing a few framed photos and her mother's old silver locket. Clara Harrington realized she had been entirely erased from her own life. She had $340 in her personal checking account. She had no friends who weren't tied to her wealth, no home, and no future in the corporate world, as Victoria had immediately blacklisted her across the industry. With the cold wind biting through her thin trench coat, Clara pulled out the single sheet of paper Abernathy had given her. The deed to 42 Brimstone Lane. It was either sleep on a park bench or take a bus to Oakhaven. The bus ride to Oakhaven took 4 hours, winding through grey coastal roads and dense, dying pine forests. Oakhaven was a forgotten mill town that the 21st century had left behind to rot. The sky here seemed permanently bruised, heavy with storm clouds that mirrored the despair tightening around Clara's chest. When she finally dragged her suitcase down the cracked sidewalks of Brimstone Lane, she thought Abernathy had made a mistake. The street was a graveyard of boarded-up storefronts and flickering street lamps. Number 42 stood at the very end of a dead-end alley, a narrow 4-story brick building that looked like it was actively trying to collapse in on itself. Faded gold lettering on the grimy front window read, "Bellows and Brass Antiquarian Books." Clara fished the heavy brass key out of her coat pocket. Her hands were shaking. She had gone from managing $1 billion portfolio to standing in front of a derelict shop that smelled faintly of mold and dead leaves. She slid the key into the deadbolt. It turned with a harsh, metallic shriek. Pushing the heavy wooden door open, Clara was immediately hit by a wall of stagnant air. She coughed, waving away thick clouds of dust that danced in the dim, grey light filtering through the dirty windows. The interior was massive, stretching far back into the gloom. Towering oak bookshelves formed a labyrinth of narrow aisles, bowing under the weight of thousands upon thousands of books. Many had tumbled to the floor, creating mountains of rotting paper and decaying leather bindings. "Hello!" Clara called out, her voice swallowed by the sheer density of the room. A rat scurried somewhere in the dark, its claws clicking against the hardwood. She found a light switch near the door and flicked it. Miraculously, a few overhead bulbs flickered to life, casting harsh yellow pools of light across the ruins. The ceiling was heavily water damaged, the plaster peeling away like dead skin. In the back, there was a small counter, an antique brass cash register covered in cobwebs, and a door leading to a back office. Clara walked through the aisles, her designer heels clicking inappropriately against the warped floorboards. She felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. This was her empire now, a graveyard of forgotten stories. She pushed open the door to the back office. It was a small, windowless room containing a rusty cot, a small space heater, a desk piled high with yellowing invoices, and a tiny attached bathroom with a dripping sink. It was bleak, depressing, and utterly filthy, but it was hers. For the first week, Clara simply survived. She traded her designer heels and tailored suits at a local consignment shop in the next town over, using the meager cash to buy heavy work boots, bleach, trash bags, and cheap canned food. The heiress who used to dine on white truffles now ate cold beans out of a tin while sitting on the floor of a dust-choked office. She cried for the first 3 nights. She cried for her father, mourning the man she thought she knew, and she cried out of sheer, unadulterated rage at Victoria and Pierce. But by the 4th morning, the tears stopped. Clara Harrington hadn't become a corporate shark by wallowing in self-pity. If her father had left her this ruin as an insult, she was going to survive it out of pure spite. She began to clean. She worked brutally, pushing her body to the point of exhaustion so she wouldn't have to think. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, bagged up ruined, mouldy books, and began organizing the salvageable inventory. To her surprise, amidst the trash, she found several first editions and rare prints. Bellows and Brass hadn't just been a bookstore. It had once been a high-end antiquarian dealer. Using the free Wi-Fi from a diner down the street, Clara set up an online seller's account. She meticulously photographed a pristine 19th century copy of Moby Dick she found wrapped in oilcloth and listed it. When it sold 2 days later for $800, Clara felt a surge of triumph that rivaled any corporate merger she had ever closed. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back. But the building was fighting her too. A massive nor'easter hit the coast during her 3rd week, hammering Oakhaven with torrential rain and gale-force winds. Clara awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of rushing water. Panic seized her. If the inventory flooded, her only lifeline was gone. She grabbed a flashlight and sprinted into the main shop. Water was pouring down the back wall near the office, pooling dangerously close to a section of rare biographies. The leak wasn't coming from the roof, it was coming from behind the drywall itself. A burst pipe in the building's ancient plumbing. Clara dragged every heavy bookshelf away from the pooling water, her muscles screaming in protest. The wall where the water originated was covered in cheap, rotting wooden paneling that had likely been installed in the 1970s. The water was gushing from behind it, threatening to flood the entire floor. Desperation overrode logic. Clara grabbed a heavy iron crowbar she had found in the basement, wedged it into the seam of the waterlogged paneling, and threw her entire body weight backward. The wood groaned, splintered, and tore away with a sickening crunch. A torrent of trapped, filthy water washed over her boots, but Clara barely noticed. She dropped the crowbar, the flashlight trembling in her hand as she stared at what was hidden behind the false wall. It wasn't just a burst pipe. The paneling had been constructed to hide a massive recessed alcove built into the original brick foundation. And sitting inside that alcove, bolted directly into the stone, was an antique, cast-iron Mosler double-door safe. It was easily 5 feet tall, covered in intricate faded gold filigree, with a heavy brass combination dial in the center. Clara stood frozen, the freezing water soaking through her socks. A safe. Why would a ruined bookstore have a bank-grade vault hidden behind a fake wall? She reached out, wiping 50 years of grime off the brass dial. It felt cold and heavy under her fingertips. She tugged at the massive iron handle, but it didn't budge a fraction of an inch. It was locked tight. For the next 48 hours, the bookstore ceased to matter. After calling a local plumber to temporarily cap the leaking pipe, paying him with the last of her book sale cash, Clara sat cross-legged on the damp floor, staring at the safe. She researched Mosler safes online. A professional safecracker would charge thousands, money she didn't have. And even if she did, she didn't want anyone else knowing about this. Victoria's reach was long, and Clara's paranoia was growing. If her father had secretly owned this building for decades, paying the taxes while letting it rot, there was a reason. This wasn't an insult. It was a hidden vault. But what was the combination? Clara pulled out her small cardboard box of keepsakes, dumping the contents onto the floor. A silver fountain pen. A faded photograph of her and her father at a baseball game. A ticket stub. And her mother's silver locket. Her father had given her the locket the day she graduated college. "Never forget where we come from, Clara," he had said, his voice unusually somber. "The foundation is everything." She picked up the locket. It was a heavy, antique piece. She popped it open. Inside was a picture of her late mother. Clara turned it over. On the back, etched so faintly into the silver that she had never noticed it before, were 6 numbers. 143208. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The foundation is everything. She crawled back over to the safe, her breath hitching. She placed her trembling fingers on the cold brass dial. "Turn right to 14. The dial clicked smoothly, heavy and precise. "Turn left, past 14 once, stop at 32. The internal tumblers made a soft metallic clunk. "Turn right directly to 08. Clara held her breath. She grabbed the heavy iron handle and pushed down. With a deep, resonant thunk that vibrated through the floorboards, the internal locking bolts retracted. The massive iron door swung open with a slow, agonizing groan of unoiled hinges. Clara shone her flashlight into the dark interior, expecting to see stacks of cash, or perhaps nothing at all. Instead, the beam illuminated an impeccably organized, climate-controlled steel interior. Sitting on the middle shelf was a stack of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Next to them were dozens of legal folders bound in red twine, a velvet jewelry box, and a single sealed manila envelope. Written on the envelope, in her father's unmistakable sharp handwriting, were 3 words. "For Clara. Run." Hands shaking violently, Clara reached into the vault and pulled out the envelope. She tore it open, pulling out a stack of glossy photographs and a handwritten letter. She looked at the first photograph and gasped, dropping the flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, casting long, erratic shadows. It was a picture of Victoria, looking 20 years younger, standing in a dimly lit warehouse. But she wasn't alone. She was handing a briefcase to a man Clara recognized instantly, Dr. Aris Sterling, the physician who had declared her father competent. And behind them, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakable in his custom-tailored suit, was Thomas Abernathy, their supposedly loyal family lawyer. Clara scrambled to pick up the letter, her eyes flying across her father's jagged script. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I am already dead, and they have taken everything. I discovered the truth too late. Victoria is not who she claims to be. The Harrington Empire was built on a lie, and she has spent the last decade positioning herself to steal it for the syndicate she represents. They have been poisoning me for months, Clara. The stroke wasn't natural. It was a synthetic neurotoxin. I altered the will, leaving you exactly $1 in this building to make them believe I hated you. It was the only way to get you out of their crosshairs. If they thought I left you anything of value, they would have killed you the same night they killed me. Everything you need to destroy them, every offshore account, every bribe, every stolen deed, is in this safe. Do not go to the police. They own the commissioner in Boston. You are a ghost now, Clara. Use the shadow. Burn them to the ground." Clara sat back on her heels, the letter slipping from her fingers. The cold, damp air of the bookstore suddenly felt electric. She wasn't a disinherited heiress anymore. She was the executioner, and she was going to tear the Harrington Empire down, brick by bloody brick. Dawn broke over Oakhaven, painting the bruised sky in weak shades of grey. Clara hadn't slept. She remained on the floor of the damp back office, surrounded by the contents of the Mosler safe, her mind operating with a terrifying, icy clarity. The grief that had paralyzed her for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical fury. Her father hadn't just died. He had been systematically dismantled, poisoned, and erased by the very woman he had brought into their home. She opened the thickest ledger, its leather cover cracking under her touch. Her father had been compiling this for years. Page after page revealed a labyrinthine network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and falsified property deeds. Victoria wasn't just a gold-digging socialite. According to the notes, she was a highly trained operative for a shadow banking syndicate out of Geneva, an organization specializing in laundering money for arms dealers and corrupt politicians. They targeted aging, vulnerable titans of industry, slowly poisoning them with untraceable synthetics while rewriting their estates. Abernathy had provided the legal camouflage, falsifying signatures and bribing notaries. Dr. Sterling had controlled the medical narrative, writing off the neurological decay as a rapid onset stroke. And Pierce was just a useful idiot, a greedy distraction meant to take the public heat while Victoria funneled the liquid assets offshore. Clara dug deeper into the vault. Beneath the ledgers lay a heavy mahogany box. She unlatched it. Inside, resting on dark velvet, were 6 stacks of bearer bonds, each bound in paper collars. $500,000 each, $3 million in total. Next to them sat a vintage platinum Patek Philippe watch and a small velvet pouch containing a dozen flawless, uncut diamonds. Her father had known she would be cut off from the traditional banking system. He had left her untraceable, liquid capital. He had funded a war. But Clara knew she couldn't fight a global syndicate alone from a rotting bookstore. She needed a weapon. She needed someone who understood the dark underbelly of corporate espionage. Someone who wasn't afraid of the monsters Victoria worked for. She needed Gideon Hayes. Gideon had been the Harrington Hospitality Group's head of cybersecurity and internal investigations until 5 years ago. He had been unceremoniously fired following a scandal involving a hacked competitor. The official story was that Gideon had gone rogue. But Clara remembered her father pulling strings to keep Gideon out of federal prison, paying him a massive severance and quietly blacklisting him from corporate America. Looking at the ledgers now, she realized her father hadn't fired Gideon for going rogue. He had fired him because Gideon had gotten too close to discovering Victoria's syndicate, and Richard was trying to save the man's life. Clara changed into her most unassuming clothes, faded jeans, a heavy woolen sweater, and a plain black beanie. She shoved 1 stack of bearer bonds and the pouch of diamonds into a cheap canvas backpack. She locked the vault, pushed the heavy oak bookshelf back over the ruined drywall, and slipped out the back door into the misty morning. She took 3 different buses, zigzagging across the state lines, until she reached a grimy, cash-only motel on the outskirts of Providence, Rhode Island. She bought a prepaid burner phone from a gas station, using cash she had withdrawn days ago. Sitting on the stained bedspread of the motel room, she dialed a number she had memorized years ago, a ghost number Gideon used for emergencies. It rang 4 times before a gruff, mechanical voice answered. "The number you have reached is out of service." Clara didn't hang up. She waited 3 seconds, then spoke clearly into the receiver. "The foundation is everything, but the roof is leaking." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Then, the mechanical voice vanished, replaced by a deep, raspy baritone. "Clara, you're supposed to be dead, kid. Or at least, wishing you were." "I'm in Oak Haven, Gideon," Clara said, her voice steady. "I have the ledger, I have the proof, and I have $3 million in bearer bonds to pay you for your time." Another pause, longer this time. "They killed Richard. You know that, right? I know, Clara whispered, gripping the phone tight enough to crack the cheap plastic casing. Are you going to help me burn them, or are you going to hide? Give me 48 hours. Don't use this phone again. Don't use your real name. If anyone asks, you're a historian cataloguing the inventory. I'll find you. The line went dead. Clara crushed the burner phone under the heel of her boot, swept the pieces into a plastic bag, and threw it into a dumpster behind a diner 3 miles away. The ghost was awake. Gideon Hayes didn't knock. 2 nights later, amidst a torrential downpour, the back door of the bookstore's office clicked open, the heavy deadbolt bypassed with terrifying ease. Clara sprang up from the cot, grabbing the heavy iron crowbar. "Put the metal down, Princess. You look ridiculous," a voice drawled from the shadows. Gideon stepped into the dim light of the single bulb. He looked older than Clara remembered. His dark hair was threaded with silver. He had a jagged scar running along his jawline, and he wore a heavy canvas jacket that smelled faintly of stale coffee and ozone. He dropped a massive reinforced pelican case onto the floor. Clara lowered the crowbar, letting out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "You bypassed a deadbolt and 2 padlocks in under a minute. Your security is a joke," Gideon replied, shedding his wet jacket. He looked around the dismal, water-stained office, his eyes landing on the stacks of mouldy books. "So, this is the command center. I expected more mahogany." "The mahogany was stolen," Clara said flatly. She moved to the bookshelf, bracing her shoulder against it, and pushed it aside to reveal the safe. She quickly spun the dial. But the capital wasn't. Gideon let out a low whistle as the heavy iron door swung open, revealing the ledgers and the bonds. He pulled out the first ledger, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten columns with practiced speed. The cynical amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a grim intensity. "Christ," he muttered. He actually documented it all. The routing numbers, the offshore shell corporations in Cyprus, and the Caymans. Richard was a dead man, walking the second he wrote the first page. He looked up at Clara. "Victoria's handlers are ruthless. If they even suspect you have this, they won't just kill you. They'll make it hurt." "They've already taken my life," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have nothing left to lose. Where do we start?" Gideon opened his pelican case, revealing a bank of heavily encrypted laptops, a satellite uplink, and an array of untraceable hard drives. He set them up on the flimsy wooden desk, plugging them into the ancient wall outlets. "We don't go after Victoria first," Gideon said, his fingers flying across the keyboards as screens flickered to life. "She's too insulated. We go after the weak link. The one who thinks he's untouchable, but is actually an idiot." "Pierce," Clara said, a grim smile touching her lips. "Exactly. Pierce inherited 40% of the company and a mountain of cash, but according to these ledgers, Victoria uses Pierce's private trust as a holding tank for the syndicate's operational funds before they are washed clean in the Caymans. He's the mule, and he probably doesn't even fully understand it." "Pierce has a gambling problem," Clara noted, leaning over Gideon's shoulder. "He lost $2 million in Monaco 3 years ago. My father bailed him out and threatened to cut him off. Victoria covered it up." "Perfect," Gideon muttered. "Let's see what the Golden Boy is up to right now." It took Gideon 6 hours to breach the outer firewalls of Pierce's private banking network, routing his connection through a dozen proxies across the globe to remain invisible. By 4 a.m., the screen displayed Pierce's recent transaction history. "He's bleeding cash," Gideon said, pointing to the screen. "He's dropped almost $500,000 in the last 48 hours at an underground crypto casino operating out of a penthouse in Manhattan. He's chasing losses." "Can you access the holding tank?" Clara asked. "The syndicate's money?" "With the routing numbers your father provided? Yes, but if we steal it, they'll just track the transfer. The blockchain is anonymous, but fiat currency leaves footprints." "I don't want to steal it," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. I want to freeze it. If Pierce loses the syndicate's money, Victoria is the one who has to answer to them. Gideon looked at her, a slow, approving grin spreading across his face. You want to trigger a federal flag? Can you route the entire balance of his holding trust, all $12 million, to an organization on the FBI's terror watch list? Something loud. Something that instantly freezes the assets and alerts the Treasury Department. It's risky. It requires forging Pierce's biometric approvals, Gideon warned. But, yes, I can spoof his IP address to make it look like the transfer originated from his phone inside that casino. Do it. Gideon's fingers danced over the keys. Lines of code cascaded down the monitors. He bypassed the two-factor authentication using a backdoor he had installed in the Harrington servers years ago. A backdoor Victoria's new IT team had been too incompetent to find. Initiating transfer, Gideon said, his voice tense. Routing $12 million to the Al-Raqi Relief Fund. It's a known front for a sanctioned paramilitary group. He hit the enter key. For 10 agonizing seconds, a loading wheel spun on the screen. Then, a green box appeared. Transfer complete. Account balance, $0. Within 20 minutes, the Treasury Department's automated algorithms are going to flag that transfer, Gideon said, leaning back in his chair. The receiving account will be frozen by federal authorities. The money is locked in bureaucratic purgatory. Pierce won't be able to touch it, and neither will Victoria. And the syndicate? Clara asked. The syndicate expects their $12 million to be washed and delivered to Geneva by Friday, Gideon replied, closing the laptop. When it doesn't arrive, they are going to ask Victoria why her idiot son is funding international terrorism instead of washing their cash. Clara looked at the blank screen. The first blow had been struck. She had just set a $12 million fire in Pierce's lap, and Victoria was about to feel the heat. Now, Clara said, turning to the heavy velvet pouch. She tossed it onto the desk. The diamonds spilled out, glittering coldly in the harsh light. Take these. Sell them through your underground contacts. We need more servers. We need wiretaps. And I need a gun. The fallout was spectacular and immediate, and 2 days after the transfer, Gideon intercepted a frantic, encrypted phone call between Pierce and Victoria. Gideon played the audio through the small speakers in the bookstore's basement, where they had relocated their server farm to hide the noise of the cooling fans. I didn't do it, Mother. I swear to God. Pierce's voice was shrill, teetering on the edge of a full panic attack. I woke up and the accounts were frozen. My personal accounts, the trust, everything. The bank won't even tell me why, they just said it's a federal hold. Lower your voice, you imbecile, Victoria hissed, her usual composed purr replaced by a venomous snarl. Do you have any idea what you've done? Kessler's people called me an hour ago. They are missing their Friday delivery. It wasn't me. Someone hacked me. No one hacks a biometric lock, Pierce. You were high, playing high-stakes baccarat in a room full of Russian mobsters. You probably handed your phone to an escort. Victoria took a deep, shuddering breath. Stay in the penthouse. Do not speak to anyone. I am calling Abernathy. We will claim you were the victim of identity theft. If Kessler's people come looking for you, do not open the door. The line went dead. Clara smiled, a cold, humorless expression. She's terrified. She should be, Gideon said, monitoring a separate screen. The Kessler Syndicate doesn't do identity theft claims. They do broken kneecaps and car bombs. But Victoria is smart. She'll try to use Abernathy to create a legal shield, stall the feds, and buy time to liquidate other assets to pay Kessler off. Then we break her shield, Clara stated. She walked over to the table where she had laid out her father's evidence. She picked up the glossy photograph of Victoria, Dr. Sterling, and Thomas Abernathy standing in the warehouse. Abernathy is a coward, Clara explained. He plays the refined gentleman, but he's terrified of prison, and he's terrified of physical violence. If he realizes the ship is sinking, He'll try to secure an immunity deal. How do we push him over the edge? Gideon asked. We send him a ghost from the past. That evening, Clara disguised herself. She wore a blonde wig she bought from a theatrical supply store, heavy sunglasses, and a trench coat. She drove Gideon's nondescript sedan into Boston, parking blocks away from the elite Commonwealth Club, where Abernathy dined every Thursday night. She handed a crisp $100 bill to a young, unsuspecting valet. Could you ensure Mr. Abernathy receives this envelope? It's highly confidential legal documents from his office. The valet nodded, slipping the unmarked manila envelope into his jacket. Clara retreated to the shadows of an alleyway across the street, watching through a pair of compact binoculars. 20 minutes later, Abernathy emerged from the club's heavy oak doors. He looked older, more haggard than he had at the will reading. The stress of the missing 12 million was clearly weighing on him. The valet approached him, handing over the envelope. Abernathy opened it under the glow of a wrought-iron street lamp. Clara watched his face through the lenses. He pulled out the photograph. It was a blown-up, high-resolution copy of the warehouse meeting. But Clara had added a single line of text printed across the bottom in stark red ink. The feds have the money. Kessler knows you're the fall guy. Abernathy went perfectly still. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase. It hit the pavement, spilling files into the gutter, but he didn't notice. He frantically looked around the dark street, his chest heaving as pure, unadulterated terror seized him. He stumbled toward his town car, practically shoving his driver aside to get in. He took the bait, Clara said into her earpiece, communicating with Gideon. I'm tracking his phone, Gideon replied. He's not going home. He's heading toward the private airfield in Bedford. He's making a run for it. He's going to try and charter a flight to a non-extradition country, Clara said, running back to her car. If he runs, Victoria will know there's a leak, but she won't know who. It will tear them apart. But Clara had underestimated Victoria's paranoia. As Abernathy's town car sped down the I-95 corridor, Gideon's voice crackled violently in Clara's ear. Clara, abort. Pull back. We have a massive problem. What's wrong? Is he at the airfield? He didn't make it. His town car just veered off the road at 80 miles an hour and slammed into a concrete overpass. GPS telemetry shows the car accelerating when it should have braked. His driver was locked out of the controls. Clara slammed on her brakes, pulling over onto the shoulder of the road. Her blood ran cold. The car was hacked. Victoria killed him. She didn't just kill him, Clara. She cleaned the slate, Gideon said, his voice tight with genuine fear. I just intercepted a dark web communication from Victoria to a private contractor, a cleaner. She knows Abernathy was spooked. She suspects someone is digging into Richard's past. She doesn't know it's me. She thinks I'm rotting in Oakhaven. That's the problem, Gideon said. She's tying up every loose end. The message she sent to the contractor included an address, 42 Brimstone Lane. She's sending someone to the bookstore to make sure the disinherited daughter isn't a threat. And Clara, the GPS ping on the contractor's phone shows he's already in Oakhaven. He's 10 minutes away from the shop. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in Clara's mouth. All of their servers, the ledgers, the bearer bonds, everything was exposed in the basement. If the cleaner found it, not only would the evidence be destroyed, but Victoria would know Clara was the architect of her destruction. I'm 40 minutes away, Clara yelled, throwing the car into drive and gunning the engine. Gideon, you have to pack up the servers, hide the ledgers, get out of there. I can't pack 100 pounds of server racks in 10 minutes, Clara. I'll have to wipe the drives and burn the room. I'm initiating the failsafe. No, we lose everything. If he finds us, we lose our lives, Gideon shouted back. I'm wiping the drives. I'll secure the bonds and the physical ledgers in the vault and lock it. I'll buy you time, but you need to stay away. Do not come back to the store. Gideon, don't play hero. The line went to static. Clara drove like a demon, pushing the sedan well past 100 miles an hour on the slick coastal roads. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't lose the evidence. She couldn't lose Gideon. When she finally skidded onto Brimstone Lane, cutting the headlights to remain undetected, she saw it. A sleek, black SUV was parked in the alleyway next to the bookstore. The front door of the shop was ajar, the lock violently shattered. Inside, the bookstore was eerily silent. There was no smoke, no sign of Gideon's fail-safe fire. Clara pulled the heavy, suppressed 9mm pistol Gideon had procured for her from her waistband. Her hands shook, but she gripped the weapon tight, forcing her breathing to slow. She slipped through the shattered front door, the darkness of the ruined bookstore swallowing her whole. She crept down the center aisle, her boots making absolutely no sound on the dusty floorboards. The smell of old paper and mildew was now mixed with a new scent. The sharp, acrid tang of gun oil. A floorboard creaked in the back office. Clara froze, raising the pistol. She inched toward the doorway. The false wall hiding the Mosler safe was wide open. Standing in front of the heavy iron vault, holding a silenced pistol in one hand and Gideon's bloody, unconscious body by the collar of his jacket in the other, was a man in a tactical turtleneck, the cleaner. He dropped Gideon to the floor with a heavy thud and turned, his cold, dead eyes scanning the darkness of the aisles. He hadn't seen her yet. Clara leveled her weapon, the red dot sight resting squarely in the center of the man's chest. She had never fired a gun at a human being. The heiress who used to negotiate boardroom contracts was gone. In her place stood a ghost, holding the trigger of her own survival. She exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I know you're there, Clara," the cleaner said, his voice calm, echoing through the dusty shop. "Victoria sends her regards." The cleaner's voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to detach itself from the shadows and wrap around Clara's throat. He hadn't turned his head, yet he knew exactly where she was standing. The red dot of her laser sight painted a small, vibrating crimson target over his heart. But the man didn't flinch. "Step into the light, Clara," the cleaner said, slowly turning to face her. His name was Anton. Gideon had warned her about Victoria's preferred contractor, a former Spetsnaz operative who operated like a ghost. Victoria was very specific. She wants this to look like a tragic accident, a structural collapse perhaps, an heiress driven mad by grief, crushed by the weight of her own useless books. "Step away from him," Clara demanded, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent trembling in her arms. She kept the gun leveled. Anton smiled, a brief, mechanical lifting of his lips. He raised his suppressed pistol, not at Clara, but pointing it down at Gideon's unconscious head. "You have no tactical training, Miss Harrington. Your grip is too tight. Your stance is unbalanced. If you pull that trigger, the recoil will pull your shot high and to the right. You'll graze my collarbone, and before you can correct your aim, I will put a bullet through Mr. Hayes's skull, and then one through your knee." Clara's mind raced. He was right. She was a CEO, not a soldier. But she was standing in her domain. She knew the geography of this rotting labyrinth better than anyone. "You're right," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low register. "I don't know how to shoot." Instead of pulling the trigger, Clara swung her arm wildly to the right and fired into the darkness. The suppressed gunshot was a sharp thwip, followed instantly by a deafening, splintering crack. She hadn't aimed at Anton. She had aimed at the primary load-bearing strut of the massive 12-foot-tall oak bookshelf directly beside him, the one she had specifically noted earlier that week as dangerously unstable due to termite damage and water rot. The heavy lead slug shattered the compromised wood. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, gravity took over. With a groan that sounded like a dying beast, 3 tons of ancient oak, waterlogged encyclopedias, and brass bindings tipped forward. Anton realized his miscalculation an instant too late. He raised his arms, diving backward, but the avalanche of wood and paper caught him. The massive shelving unit crashed down with earth-shattering force, pinning his legs and lower torso beneath an impenetrable mountain of debris. His pistol clattered across the floorboards, sliding into the darkness. Clara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, kicking Anton's weapon further under a fallen desk. She kept her own gun trained squarely on his face as he let out a sharp, choked gasp of pain. "Don't move!" she snarled, stepping over the debris. She reached down, grabbing Gideon by the collar of his jacket, and dragged his heavy frame away from the wreckage. Gideon groaned, his eyes fluttering open. A nasty gash above his left eyebrow was leaking blood down the side of his face. He blinked at the ceiling, then looked at Clara, then at the trapped assassin. "Did you drop a library on him?" Gideon muttered, wincing as he pushed himself up into a sitting position. "It seemed faster than negotiating," Clara replied, her chest heaving. "Are the drives wiped?" "Yeah," Gideon coughed, holding his ribs. "The digital footprint is gone. The physical ledgers are locked in the vault. He didn't get the combination." Anton gritted his teeth, blood trickling from his nose. "You are delaying the inevitable. Victoria knows you are here. If I don't check in within the hour, she will send a team you cannot drop furniture on." Clara knelt beside the trapped cleaner, the muzzle of her pistol resting inches from his forehead. The coldness in her eyes startled even Gideon. "Where is the check-in device?" Anton smirked. "Go to hell." Clara didn't blink. She shifted the gun, aiming it directly at his kneecap, which was already pinned at a sickening angle beneath the wood. "I have lost my father, my company, and my life. If you think I care about the Geneva Convention right now, you are sorely mistaken. Where is the phone?" The assassin searched her eyes, looking for a bluff. He found a void. Slowly, he nodded toward his inner jacket pocket. Gideon crawled over, fishing out a heavily encrypted satellite phone. He brought up the screen. "It's a dead man's switch," Gideon breathed. An automated SMS text is queued up. It says, "The bookstore is clear. The girl is gone. It's scheduled to send in exactly 12 minutes. "Can you alter it?" Clara asked. "No. It's a locked protocol," Gideon said, wiping blood from his eye. "If we stop it, Victoria knows he failed. If we let it send, she thinks you're dead or vanished, and she lowers her guard." "Let it send," Clara said. She looked down at Anton. "Gideon, find the zip ties you use for the server cables. Bind his hands and gag him. We have a 12-minute head start before Victoria thinks she's won. And when she thinks she's won, she's going to make her final move to pay off the Kessler Syndicate." As Gideon worked to secure the furious trapped assassin, Clara walked over to the Mosler safe. She spun the dial, 143208, and pulled the heavy iron door open. She grabbed the leather ledgers and the remaining bearer bonds, shoving them into Gideon's pelican case. They were abandoning the bookstore. The sanctuary was compromised. But Clara wasn't running to hide anymore. She was going hunting. They established a new base of operations in an abandoned, foreclosed auto garage on the industrial edge of Providence. The smell of motor oil and ozone replaced the scent of mildewed books. It had been 24 hours since the incident at the bookstore. Victoria had received Anton's automated message. Thinking Clara was out of the picture and Abernathy was dead, she moved aggressively to consolidate her remaining capital. Gideon, patched up with butterfly bandages and running on black coffee, sat before a makeshift array of monitors resting on a stack of tires. "Okay, I've tapped into the Kessler Syndicate's communication nodes. Since Pierce's 12 million got frozen by the feds, Victoria has been desperately liquidating Harrington hospitality assets, selling off international properties at a massive loss just to generate cash. She needs to deliver the money to Kessler by Friday," Clara said, staring at the corkboard they had erected, pinning up photos of their targets. "Today is Wednesday. Where is she making the handoff? That's the problem, Gideon said, rubbing his temples. Victoria is too smart to do it herself. She's going to use a proxy, someone who can access high-security areas without being questioned. Someone with clearance. Clara looked at the board. Her eyes locked onto the photograph of Dr. Aris Sterling. The doctor, Clara said softly. He has security clearance at Boston General Hospital. They have a private subterranean helipad for VIP medical transports. It's completely off the grid. No TSA, no customs. She's going to load the cash onto a medical chopper and fly it straight to a private jet waiting in international airspace. It fits, Gideon agreed. But we can't prove it without Sterling. Then we break Sterling. Dr. Aris Sterling lived in a glass and steel monstrosity overlooking the Charles River, funded by the blood money he had earned slowly killing Richard Harrington. He was a man of exquisite tastes and fragile nerves. Unlike Anton, he was not a hardened killer. He was a coward in a white coat. At 11 p.m., Sterling returned home from a charity gala. He unlocked his penthouse door, stepping into the dark, silent foyer. He tossed his keys onto the marble credenza and walked into the living room, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch. You always did prefer the Macallan 25, didn't you, Aris? Sterling dropped the crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Clara stepped out of the shadows. She was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, a stark contrast to the ragged girl who had been exiled to Oakhaven weeks ago. She looked exactly like her father. Gideon stood a few feet behind her, arms crossed, blocking the exit. Clara, Sterling gasped, his face draining of colour. You're supposed to be in a grave, like Abernathy. Clara finished the sentence, stepping into the moonlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I'm afraid Anton encountered some structural difficulties. Sterling backed away, his knees hitting the edge of a leather sofa. I don't know what you're talking about. Clara pulled a thick file folder from under her arm and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy slap. Those are copies of my father's ledgers, Clara said coldly. Detailed accounts of the synthetic neurotoxins you prescribed, the falsified medical records, the exact dates and amounts of the bribes Victoria wired to your offshore accounts in Zurich. Sterling stared at the folder as if it were a coiled snake. Abernathy grew a conscience, Clara lied smoothly, weaving her trap. He realized Victoria was going to sacrifice him to the feds, so he reached out to me. He gave me everything before she hacked his car and ran him off the bridge. You are the only loose end left, Doctor. Do you really think Victoria is going to let you live once you make the handoff on Friday? She needs me, Sterling stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm orchestrating the medical transport. She needs the transport. She doesn't need you, Gideon chimed in, his voice grave. Once that helicopter takes off, she'll have one of Kessler's men toss you into the Atlantic. You know too much. Sterling collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. He was broken. What do you want? He whispered. I want the location and exact time of the handoff, Clara demanded. And I want you to call Victoria right now. Tell her Kessler's men moved the timeline up. Tell her they demand a face-to-face meeting with her personally before they accept the cash. If she doesn't show, the deal is off. She won't believe me, Sterling panicked. She will if you tell her Kessler knows about the 12 million the feds froze, Gideon instructed. Tell her Kessler thinks she's wearing a wire for the FBI. She'll have no choice but to show up to prove her loyalty. Trembling violently, Sterling reached for his phone. He dialed Victoria's private number. Clara and Gideon listened as he fed her the lie, his terror making his performance incredibly convincing. When he hung up, he looked at Clara with hollow eyes. Tomorrow night, 2 a.m., the abandoned shipyard at Pier 44. She's bringing the cash in 3 reinforced medical coolers. Clara picked up the file folder. Pack a bag, Doctor. If I were you, I'd be out of the country before sunrise. Because by tomorrow night, Boston is going to burn. Pier 44 was a desolate stretch of decaying concrete and rusted shipping containers, bathed in the eerie, sodium orange glow of the Boston harbor lights. Fog rolled off the dark water, obscuring the jagged edges of the industrial graveyard. At 1:45 a.m., two sleek black-armored Mercedes pulled into the abandoned lot. From her vantage point on the catwalk of a rusted loading crane 50 feet above the ground, Clara watched through night vision binoculars. Gideon sat beside her, a heavy sniper rifle resting on the railing, though it was loaded with non-lethal rubber slugs. He was monitoring the encrypted police frequencies. Victoria stepped out of the lead vehicle. She wore a dark trench coat, her face tight with anxiety. Beside her was Pierce, looking pale and terrified, clutching a briefcase. Two heavily armed private security contractors pulled 3 large medical coolers from the trunk. "Where are they?" Victoria snapped, her voice echoing in the damp air. "Sterling said they would be here." Suddenly, headlights flared at the far end of the pier. 3 dark SUVs rolled out of the fog, moving with predatory grace. They parked in a semicircle, boxing in Victoria's vehicles. 4 men stepped out. They weren't Victoria's security. They were Kessler Syndicate enforcers. Brutal, silent men wearing heavy tactical gear. The lead enforcer, a man with a scarred neck, stepped forward. "You called an audible, Victoria. Mr. Kessler does not like surprises. Why did you demand a face-to-face?" Victoria frowned, her composure slipping. "I didn't demand anything. Your people called Sterling. You moved the timeline up." The enforcer stopped. His hand slowly drifted toward the weapon at his hip. "We did no such thing. We were expecting the helicopter transport tomorrow." High above, Clara pressed a button on a small remote detonator in her pocket. Below, hidden inside the 3 medical coolers Victoria had brought, a series of small, non-lethal smoke charges detonated. Thick, billowing clouds of purple smoke erupted from the coolers, hissing loudly. "It's a trap!" one of the syndicate enforcers yelled, drawing his weapon. "No! Wait!" Victoria screamed, raising her hands. But the chaos had already begun. From the shadows of the shipping containers, blinding floodlights snapped on, instantly turning the pier as bright as midday. "FBI! Drop your weapons! Put your hands on your heads!" A megaphone shattered the night. SWAT vans, having approached silently with their headlights cut under Gideon's coordinated cyber blackout of the pier's security cameras, swarmed the area. Heavily armed federal agents poured out, forming a perimeter. Clara smiled. Gideon hadn't just tapped the syndicate's communications. He had sent an anonymous, undeniable data packet to the FBI Cyber Division, detailing a massive money laundering handover occurring at Pier 44, involving a known international terror funding syndicate. Victoria's security dropped their weapons immediately. The Kessler enforcers hesitated for a split second before surrendering. Engaging a heavily armed FBI SWAT team was suicide. Victoria stood frozen, the purple smoke swirling around her expensive boots. Pierce was hyperventilating, dropping his briefcase. "Mother, what do we do?" Pierce sobbed, grabbing her arm. Victoria violently shoved him away. "Agent!" she screamed toward the advancing FBI squad. "Agent, listen to me. I have nothing to do with this. My son, Pierce, he orchestrated this. The frozen 12 million, the crypto transfers, it was all him. He's a degenerate gambler who got in deep with the cartel. I was just trying to pay off his debts to save his life." Pierce stared at his mother, absolute horror washing over his face. You're blaming me?" "Shut up, Pierce," Victoria hissed. "It's the only way to save the company." "Get on the ground, both of you," a SWAT commander barked, tackling Pierce to the pavement and snapping cuffs on his wrists. Another agent grabbed Victoria, forcing her against the hood of the Mercedes, reading her rights as she shrieked obscenities. From the catwalk, Clara watched her stepmother's empire crumble in a matter of seconds. The betrayal Victoria had levelled at her father had finally come full circle, tearing her own family apart. "Federal agents have secured the scene," Gideon said, packing up his rifle. "They're opening the coolers. They'll find the cash, the ledgers I planted, and the offshore routing numbers. Victoria is going to federal prison for the rest of her natural life. Kessler will likely put a bounty on her head the second she's behind bars. She's finished." Clara lowered her binoculars. The burning knot of anger that had resided in her chest for weeks finally unspooled. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an exhalation. "It's over," Clara whispered. "What happens now?" Gideon asked, looking at her. "With Pierce going down for terror funding and Victoria indicted for racketeering, the Harrington Hospitality Group's board of directors is going to panic. The stock will plummet." "Let it," Clara said smoothly. "I've already contacted Thomas Abernathy's junior partner, who holds my father's original untampered will, the one I secured from the Mosler safe. I am the rightful heir. I'm going to let the stock tank, buy back the controlling shares for pennies on the dollar using the bearer bonds, and liquidate the entire corrupt structure. You're not going to rebuild it. My father's empire was built on a foundation of poison," Clara said, turning toward the ladder. "I'm going to tear it down and build something entirely new, something clean." 3 months later, Clara Harrington stood in the doorway of 42 Brimstone Lane. The rain was falling in Oakhaven, but the inside of the bookstore was transformed. The mould and rot were gone. The floors had been restored, the heavy oak bookshelves reinforced, and warm golden lighting illuminated thousands of meticulously organized antiquarian books. The massive Mosler safe in the back office now sat with its doors wide open, serving as a display case for rare first editions. Gideon Hayes sat at the newly installed mahogany front desk, typing away on a laptop, acting as the store's incredibly overqualified security and inventory manager. Clara smiled, sipping a cup of black coffee. She had regained her billions, but she no longer lived in a glass penthouse. She had found her true legacy in the dust and the shadows. The ghost had reclaimed her life, but she would never forget the bookstore that taught her how to fight. What an absolute roller coaster. Clara went from having everything ripped away to orchestrating the ultimate revenge, proving that you can take the girl out of the boardroom, but you can't take the boardroom out of the girl. The twist with Victoria throwing Pierce under the bus just shows how ruthless some people can be when their backs are against the wall. Do you think Clara did the right thing by tearing down her father's corrupt empire instead of keeping the power for herself? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, hidden vaults, and absolute justice, hit that like button to help support the channel. Don't forget to share this incredible drama with your friends, and make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another thrilling real-life story. See you in the next one.